Welcome everyone, and thanks for tuning in to this third part of our podcast series organized together with Netcetera, where we'll cover risk topics with different guests on the show. Today it's time for part 3, where we'll talk about authentication and payment security in the APAC region. My name is Rogier van der Voort. I am the CEO of a company called PCN, and we provide recruitment services for the payments and fintech space specifically. But we also have a weekly podcast called In Check with Fintech, which you might be tuning into, and these video series, which will be published on or are published on YouTube. I'm joined today by 2 honored guests. The first one is Nitin Palande. He's currently the head of sales and partnerships APAC for Netcetera. And also Gautam Pandey, who's the product management identity solutions for Asia Pacific at Mastercard. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Roger, for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Who is better to introduce themselves than the people who we're talking about, right? So, Nitin, can I ask you to maybe give a short introduction to our viewers and listeners?
Sure. Thanks, Roger. So, like Roger mentioned, my name's Nitin. I head sales and partnerships at Netcetera here in APAC. A quick background about Netcetera. We were established in 1996 out of Switzerland. Today, we operate obviously in the European side, but also in the Middle East and Africa, and then APAC. We interconnect the payment ecosystem, which means that on one side, we work with issuers, whether legacy banks, digital banks, neobanks. And on the other side, we, of course, work with payment service providers, payment gateways, acquirers, and large merchants. And in between, of course, we have the card networks that we work with very, very closely. Our business is, if I were to encapsulate it, is secure digital payments.
Great. Thank you very much. Gautam, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Really delighted to join this session today. I will take the cue from Nitin. I work in security space. In identity solutions, to be more specific, and my primary focus is to work on products for card authentication flows, and I'm working with Netcetera and other ecosystem players to make sure that we have a robust digital authentication experience for Mastercard cardholders.
Great. Well, excited to have you both, and I think who better than to discuss payment security with than with both of you. So maybe let's start with, part of a payments flow is obviously authentication, right? It's quite key to any payment flow. Nitin, let me start with you. Why authentication?
So look, when it comes to online and mobile commerce, right, the need for, I would say, transaction authentication has never been greater. Global spending on e-commerce has reached close to $6 trillion and a growth of almost 30-odd%. But losses from illegal purchases using stolen credit cards and numbers are growing nearly fast. What banks and card issuers, merchants, processors use, different forms of authentication to protect themselves from fraudulent transactions and chargebacks. So what essentially a payment authentication does is it validates who a user is. You can think of payment authentication as having a key to the front door. So for example, payment authentication could include one-time PINs, which is codes sent via text, email, or phone call. It could use authentication apps, which essentially generate secure codes that change every few minutes. And now more and more, we see things like biometrics, which is, your fingerprint, a retinal scan, facial recognition, etc. But, authentication must be accurate and seamless to prevent chargebacks. And that's where what we see happening today within the industry is layering. So you use multiple different authentication factors to get the right sort of result that you want.
Great. Gautam, do you agree or anything to add to that?
100%. So there is data to prove that strong cardholder authentication drives a safer online payment experience for consumers, right? And the authentication standards have also evolved over the years. There is access to better standards to make sure the transaction is authenticated silently if there is a need for that, without interrupting the whole cardholder payment experience. So I completely agree. Strong cardholder authentication has three principles: knowledge, possession, and adherence. So in most of the markets, one of the other interpretation of that typically gets played out in AP. And we see a distinct shift from, as Nitin was mentioning, from additional factor of authentication to multi-factor authentication, because we're all connected, and it's connected commerce resulting in a connected authentication story. So there is a distinct shift that we see in many markets today of moving to multi-factor authentication than just relying on additional factor authentication.
Yeah, and I think a form of multi-factor authentication is 3D Secure, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's one.
So what's on the roll is the 3DS1 decommissioning. What are the dates and what are the key considerations for that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So 3DS1 is on the path of decommission for MasterCard Identity Check program. It is planned for a decommission on 18th of October this year. With that, and there's an exception in India and Bangladesh. There's certain exceptions, but that's the only two countries where 3DS1 will continue for one more year. Everywhere else, it's getting decommissioned on 18th October. What it means is that it's time for the entire ecosystem to migrate to EMV3DS as a protocol. We started on this journey way back in 2018 when we started announcing onboarding of our customers on EMV3DS platform. We currently support two protocols. These are protocol versions 2.1 and 2.2. And our strong recommendation to all customers is to process 100% of the volume on EMV3DS and completely move away from 3DS1, if not they've already done.
Because India and Bangladesh are still on 3DS1, or they will remain on 3DS1 for another year.
The customers in these countries have an option to use 3DS1, but they obviously can use EMV3DS as well. But just to the nature of the landscape in those countries, we continue to support 3DS1, but we actively encourage even customers in these countries to use EMV3DS as the preferred method of completing the authentication.
Makes sense. Nathan, what do you see are the key considerations for that decommissioning?
Yeah, no, look, I think when you look at 3DS1 versus 3DS2, the shift to 3DS2 is very, very compelling. I have a couple of points just around that. I am totally aligned on what Gautam said, with the dates and why that exemption was given essentially to countries like Bangladesh and India. But going back to the reasons of why that shift needs to happen, number one is 3DS2 gives you a very, very streamlined user experience. And the frictionless flow is one of the main advantages of 3DS2. Number two, you can think about 3DS2 giving you higher approval rates, where merchants send extensive data regarding each transaction, which allows the issuer to determine whether or not to challenge that transaction. Robust security, I would say, is the third reason in terms of why the move to 3DS2. And again, strong authentication methods like token-based or biometrics authentication happens. I guess, both from our business perspective, whether it's MasterCard or Netcetera, increased conversion, that is definitely what we would like to see, and a significant reduction in what we call cart abandonment. A liability shift, I think that's a big one where merchants will reap off the benefits of additional protection thanks to the liability shift that happens where the liability of fraud shifts to the issuer.
Just to summarize then, Nitin, so higher acceptance, card abandonment, change of liability for the issuer, compliance, those are really important facets in order to be successful with 3DS2, yeah?
And those are the compelling reasons why, the push to 3DS2 is happening.
Makes sense, yeah. Is there an educational component to all this? I mean, do merchants, do consumers need to be informed and educated on why 3DS, well, I guess maybe consumers not necessarily, because if merchants start using it, then consumers will automatically start using it. But do merchants see the benefit of using it, or do you see reluctance of any form?
Speaking of maybe Southeast Asia, we definitely see a lot of PSPs, a lot of payment service providers, payment gateways, and large merchants already having moved to 3DS2 and above. They definitely see why this was necessary. Obviously, like I said, they want higher conversion rates. They want lesser of cart abandonment. So the benefits are there to see. So Mastercard has also been doing a lot of education around that. We ourselves, from a Netcetera perspective, have been going out to market, whether it is webinars, seminars, podcasts like these, LinkedIn, and educating the merchants, PSPs, payment gateways as to why this is necessary. And I think that message has seeped through for most of the countries, I would say. There could still be a few stragglers, but I think they'll be able to catch up very quickly.
Gautam, do you see the same? Is there certain countries who are more open to it than others or not?
Yeah, I think the adoption curve played out, right? And having been involved in this right from 2018, I can see that there are certain countries which are early adopters of this the standard, clearly saw the merit in kind of moving to this standard and kind of improving the whole digital commerce experience. I would agree to Nitin's comments that we've reached a steady state of adoption in most markets. It is with the decommission in 3DS1, we recognize that there is a hard stop. And we are engaging with our ecosystem players, merchants, acquirers, issuers through, again, very similar engagement formats such as our Academy on web platforms, one-on-one workshops, and market level webinars and sessions, and of course sessions like these, right? So there is awareness that, and it's not new, right? It's been in the making for 4 years. So there is work that the ecosystem has put in terms of building awareness. The standards are well understood, at least by the teams who are kind of working on the core software part of it. And now I think it's reached a stage where we're talking about evolution of these standards, right? So there are different protocols that are getting published. Right? So the baseline adoption curve, I would agree with Nitin that that's been achieved. And it's time for us to kind of now look forward to future-looking technologies and how that baseline experience can be further improved.
So how can a merchant or a PSP then optimize their transaction success rates?
Yes, yeah, that's a very interesting question. That's something that often gets debated in one-on-one conversations, right? So my typical advice would be to kind of first understand the entire transaction lifecycle, and without just leaving the technical aspect aside, right? We just kind of map, there's authentication, authorization, followed by clearing and settlement, right? Those are broadly how a transaction lifecycle runs through. As I mentioned, in many markets, authentication is a merchant choice, merchant or an acquirer choice. Recommended to use authentication most of the time. In authentication, typically the abandonment is usually seen when the cardholder is stepped up, right? And it's due to two reasons. A, you're redirecting to a different environment, right? And there are technical reasons why that redirect could lead to an abandonment. And the second one is if the cardholder awareness is not enough, the cardholder kind of jumps out of that step-up process, right? There is also instances of just the connectivity, the technical connectivity is not robust, right? Which leads to abandonment even before a transaction could be reviewed by the issuer. We have, with the understanding of what could lead to abandonment, and thankfully with the way the message is constructed now, there are technical identifiers which the merchants or their payment service providers like Netcetera can advise to merchants on really having a good understanding of why the transaction is getting dropped off, right? And once they have a good understanding of that, In our experience, usually it's a easier solve if it's technical, right? If it's just a matter of a coding change, it's much easier. If it's behavioral, right? If the type of customer that's coming online for a certain line of business doesn't like to be stepped up, then it must be some cardholder education or awareness. That can be done on the merchant environment or on the issuer environment, right? So that's broadly how an abandonment gets addressed in authentication. In authorization, the transaction comes for final issuer decision, right? And in that, what we've been attempting to do is provide a holistic view to the issuer of the transaction if it's gone through authentication. So we look at a concept called dynamic linking, right? So we link the authentication insights and deliver that to the issuer during authorization. So all those insights are available to the issuer for making the best authorization decision. The other thing that we often recommend to merchants is to look through the decline reason codes, right? And have a better understanding of why the transaction was declined to decide what the retry strategy could be, right? It could be declined due to financial reasons. That has a very different call to action. And if it's declined due to non-financial reasons, is it life cycle? Is it security or a policy decline, right? So there are some changes that we've done in the way we message this information back to acquirers and hopefully to merchants to help them define, what their retry strategy can be, right? So it's a combination of optimization in the authentication stage with, working with the experts just to see, what can be done better, right? And it begins with having a KPI for abandonment, right? So are we measuring those abandonment rates today? And once we've gone through the authentication cycle, authentication transaction usually will have a better approval rate than a non-authenticated transaction. So there's already an approval rate lift that is baked in. And then, for the transactions that are getting declined, an analysis of why the transaction got declined usually helps the merchant or the acquirer to kind of plan a good retry strategy.
So the transaction success rate is basically dependent on one, authentication, and two, authorization, right? And authentication is all about the core of authentication is the experience, and of authorization, you didn't mention it, but I can imagine it's probably speed, right? For customers, and for merchants, it matters how quickly can you authorize a payment. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, at the end of the day, everything is financial messages getting exchanged and there needs to be decision making which needs to be automated mostly, right? Whether it's authentication or authorization, but to define a transaction success rate, it's essentially often also called as full funnel conversion rate by merchants, which essentially means that I want to really map how the customer journey was right from the time that the card got finalized, right? So and we can attribute the drop off to authentication or authorization, but it's important to have that full visibility across all transaction life cycles to kind of then decide what's the optimum way to redesign the entire approach, right? So hope that helps bring some clarity.
Definitely, yeah. And part of authentication or type of authentication is also risk-based authentication, right, Nitin? So what is it and how does it improve intelligence in payment messages?
Sure. So the new version of this protocol supports the new payment methods and functionalities, and is designed in a way to cover new arising payment methods. So the cardholders, bank, and other stakeholders can use this information to assess the risk level of the transaction in milliseconds, the so-called risk-based authentication. So if the risk score is high, the available data suggests with a high probability that the transaction is not being initiated by a legitimate cardholder, and the bank should decide to further verify the transaction, sending it to a step-up flow. If the risk score is low, then the transaction data in combination with behavioral analysis and profiles indicates that there is a high probability that a legitimate cardholder is making the purchase, and the issuer can send the transaction through a frictionless flow. So, there is more than 100 plus data fields that are essentially being analyzed, which helps essentially the banks, the merchants, the PSPs, the issuers make more sort of confident decisions. So if you look at a pure purchase sort of perspective, browser-based transaction information such as IP, browser, device information can be sent using the 3DS2 protocol. For app-based transactions, for instance, app information can be sent through, which is gathered by the sort of SDKs. And with 3DS2, merchants can provide order details such as shopping basket information, purchase amount, currency code, consumer details, all of that, which essentially is driving, like I said, very fast sort of authentication in terms of this. And that's where this whole risk-based authentication plays a very, very important role in terms of e-commerce going forward.
Gautam, do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the foundation of EMV 3DS, if I may use that term. The foundation is that there must be rich contextual data that can exchange using the EMV 3DS rails, right? So there is information about the connection, the cardholder, and the merchant that is all packaged in the EMV PDF message and delivered to the issuer. To help issuers make the best authentication decisions, Mastercard has enabled a service called Smart Authentication, which is our risk-based authentication score that's delivered to every issuer on every EMV 3DS authentication request, payment authentication request. It essentially is a risk submission or a summary of our determination of that transaction based on our AI and machine learning model. And it is eventually designed to help improve the whole cardholder experience because less risky transactions are not required to be stepped up, right? As Nitin mentioned. So, and once there is a good, robust risk score at an industry level, it can be benchmarked very easily, right? Because the reported fraud can very easily help feedback the model if the model is not working as expected, right? So that's pretty foundational to this upgrade from 3DS1 to EMV 3DS.
So risk-based authentication creates a risk score, basically, which then populates the payment messages in order to make a better informed decision.
Yes. So it's essentially a risk score, which can be delivered to issuers in a couple of ways, but it helps the issuer to decide, am I comfortable in frictionlessly authenticating the consumer? Because I've seen either this consumer or a cohort of similar transactions before, which has not resulted in high fraud, right? So I'm comfortable in taking that decision without challenging the cardholder, right? So that's the essence of risk-based authentication.
Nitin, what are typical parameters that are looked at in such a risk score?
So in such a risk score, so if you could look at obviously the IP address where the consumer is shopping from, you could look at whether their billing address is the same as their shipping address. You could look at, is this person's normal transaction below a certain threshold, or is this amount really, really high? You could look at maybe even things like, is this the normal time that the consumer normally shops? So there is a multitude of data, over 200 fields, essentially that brings this score up, which essentially just helps, issuers, etc. In terms of whether thinking in terms of, hey, should we challenge this or should we just get the consumer to go through a frictionless flow?
So 200 parameters looked at in milliseconds, right?
Absolutely.
That's so cool. Yeah, nice. Great, Gautam, back to you. So in terms of there's device biometrics as well, right? How is that used to improve the authentication experience?
Yeah, that's one part that we're really excited about. As consumers, we, I think, are getting more accustomed to using device biometrics for not just payments, but even for our regular banking transactions. And there are a couple of ways in which biometrics can potentially be used in 3DS authentication. One is when such an authenticator is deployed at the issuer end, right? And when the transaction reaches the issuer decides to use a mobile app-based biometric authentication service, right? So that's one way of doing it. It's called out-of-band authentication. The other and perhaps a better architected way of doing this is delegated authentication, where biometric within the merchant environment is used to authenticate the cardholder, right? And how does that function or work? It essentially is a combination of 3DS rails and another standard called Fast Identity Online, FIDO, which is essentially now part of EMV 3DS 2.2 protocol. With these two standards converging at an industry level, what it allows us to do is essentially curate an experience where cardholder is not required to be redirected to an issuer environment to verify himself. The cardholder can use device biometrics within the merchant environment and choose the merchants where he wants such an experience, right? So as a consumer, if I have I pre-identified certain merchants where I'm comfortable in using biometric for checkout, I can use the service, right? So it's called Identity Check Express, which will be available in select AP countries during the course of this year.
That's really cool. Nitin, anything to add there?
Yeah, no, look, I was looking at some figures, and there was a recent study, I think it was from Juniper Research, and that predicts that mobile biometrics will authenticate something like 2 trillion in remote and in-store payments in 2023.
Wow.
And that is up from an estimated 124 billion in 2018. It also estimates, that over 80% of smartphones will have some form of biometric hardware by 2023. So that is definitely where we're going in the future. And then, of course, like to what Gautam said, there are multitude of advantages of biometrics in payments. One is, of course, high security. The advantage is that they allow you to prove your identity using characteristics that are unique to you. Since the data is something of who you are, it's much likely to be forgotten, stolen, or forged, in contrast to something that you use, like, or something like you possess, like a document or a card. That's number one. Number two would be, I think, increased customer experience, because I think biometrics, and at least also in our experience, we've seen there's a very low level of friction than passwords. Using biometric authentication for payments is quick and convenient. Users don't have to remember pins, passwords, etc. And then I think going forward is definitely a competitive edge for business, right? Because it provides better security. The moment you provide better security, the customer trust in a business increases. When that happens, it's a business opportunity essentially to drive this consumer behavior and keep consumers coming back for more. So definitely, I think that's a future, and that's just going to keep on growing in leaps and bounds.
I think if you talk about the invisibility of payments, as I like to call it, being the consumer having no idea what's happening when you actually do a payment, right? This is even more invisible. I mean, I have no idea of how strongly I press my phone or how I go over my phone, and that it's all saved and being used for these kind of purposes, I think is just amazing. I mean, the future is now.
And you have multiple types coming, right? I mean, with most phones, we use the fingerprint, but now you have facial recognition, you have iris scans, and who knows what the future will bring.
Absolutely, yeah. Great, guys. Before we close off, Gautam, let me first ask you, any closing remarks, key takeaways from today's session?
Yeah, one would be a gentle reminder on the 3DS 1D commission. It's an important industry milestone, and we would really want the ecosystem to be ready to make this change if they've not done it. The other point is that the standards will continue to evolve, and these standards, and there's an industry level effort to make sure that with every version of this protocol, there is more there's an ability for a cardholder to verify themselves with as less friction as possible, right? So you'll hear us talk about, some of the industry standards like fast identity online that I referred to. We are very excited to kind of bring biometric mainstream and card authentication with such capability, and we see that as the key anchor for the next few years in terms of how digital authentication will be done.
Great, thank you. Nitin, any closing remarks or key takeaways?
No, I think, like whatever Gautam said, totally agree there. And I'll start off with the other end. Also, like Gautam mentioned, biometrics, we definitely going to see more and more use of that. Customers can verify themselves using fingerprint, face, voice recognition. Definitely, we see adaptability, support for in-app authentication, and ensure that your challenge screens, etc., compatibility with mobile devices. But overall, I think 3DS2 is going to essentially be a game changer. We hope to see a significant reduction in sort of cart abandonment rates. We definitely want to see higher approval rates because of this extensive data that is being generated through each transaction, which gives every participant, a view in terms of what this transaction is, high risk, low risk, do we need to sort of step up and challenge this, etc. And then, of course, frictionless flow. I would say that would be also one of the main advantages. But these standards are going to keep evolving as e-commerce grows.
So thanks, guys. I think 3DS, if my main takeaway is there to support the future of e-commerce, right? Whether it's increasing the performance for the cardholders or the experience, for the cardholders, or giving better approval rates, less chargebacks, less fraud for the merchants and the issuers. It's there to support that. Great to have you both. Thanks for being here, sharing your views on the show. I hope it's been helpful as well to our viewers and listeners, whichever platform you're tuning in on. And thanks for listening and viewing to this episode of the Netcetera Risk series. So this is part 3. So if you haven't listened to or seen part 1 and 2, then I definitely recommend to go out and look at that on YouTube, Spotify, Apple iTunes, or any of your podcast platforms that you're using, and look for In Check with FinTech and then the Netcetera Risk series. Thanks again, guys. Watch this space. It's been great to have you on the show, and see you soon.
Thanks, Roger.
Thanks,
you.
Gautam. Bye.
Bye.